Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Cover Crops and Weed Management, How to Avoid Herbicide Carryover Injury and How Cover Crops Improve Weed Management. My name is Julia Freuk. I am the project coordinator here at the Partnership for Ag Resource Management and will be hosting the webinar this morning. We are joined today by my colleague, Caitlin Leahy, project manager for PARM, who will provide a brief introduction. I'm also pleased to welcome our guest speaker, Daniel Smith, Southwest Region Outreach Specialist for the Nutrient and Pest Management Program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison Agricultural and Life Sciences and Division of Extension. Before we begin, I will go over some brief logistics. Please remember to submit questions for Daniel on the GoToWebinar panel during his presentation. I will moderate the questions for approximately 10 minutes after the presentation. You will receive an email in the next few days with the webinar recording and link to the webinar evaluation. The recording will also be available on partnershipfarm.org and YouTube. By attending today's webinar, you are eligible for 1.5 CCA continuing education units, 1 for nutrient management and 0.5 for integrated pest management. You must be present for the entire webinar to receive those points. If you submitted your CCA number at registration and are watching the webinar live, no further action is required to submit your CEUs. If you are watching this on demand at a later date, please be sure to watch the entire presentation through the GoToWebinar platform and not YouTube to receive credit. If you watch the recording more than 2 weeks after the original broadcast, please email your CCA number to julia@partnershipfarm.org to ensure your credits are submitted. Please make a big note that credits often take a few weeks to appear in your account. If it has been more than 4 weeks, please contact my email. And now, with the logistics taken care of, I will turn it over to Caitlin.
Thanks, Julia, and thanks everyone for being here today. The Partnership for Ag Resource Management, or PARM as we call ourselves, is an effort of the IPM Institute of North America, a nonprofit organization made up of several projects in agriculture and community IPM that focus on using the power of the marketplace to improve outcomes in health, environment, and economics, all key elements of sustainability. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, 2019 was a record wet year for several regions in the U.S., based on data going back to 1895. This increased rainfall has substantial impacts on our water quality and profits for farmers and agricultural retailers. Increased algal bloom growth resulting from nutrient runoff has been occurring in several areas around the nation, with much advertisement in the Western Lake Erie Basin in Ohio, where the PARM project initially started. Many of you can remember in 2014, the water supply was shut off to over 400,000 residents in and surrounding Toledo, Ohio, from the toxicity level of the blue-green algae. You can see by the graph on the bottom that these blooms are on average becoming more frequent and severe. This is something so many of us are even observing in our own backyards. As we all know, this also affects profitability as vital fertilizer is lost with surface runoff and leaching instead of used for crop uptake. And this is where our project comes into play. PARM addresses water quality issues by working with ag retailers to promote, track, and report on profitable products and services that keep inputs on cropland. Through retail sales, or in other words, customer adoption of practices like cover crops and variable rate technology, we can estimate nutrient loss reductions based on peer review studies. These estimates are variable due to factors like slope, soil type, and weather, but give our participants and our project the best idea of where we can make a difference. We track these sales through annual surveys and provide both aggregate public reports and confidential nutrient stewardship reports for participants. The 90+ ag retail locations we partner with in the Great Lakes and Upper Mississippi River basins and beyond are working hard to improve water quality. Our survey results show average increases in several products and services, including soil sampling and cover crops. Our participants represent over 5.3 million acres, giving us ample data on current adoption rates, retail profitability of products and services, and barriers to adoption. By analyzing our survey results, we can offer catered educational tools to retail locations that help staff convey the benefits of nutrient management practices to customers. We also offer watershed and statewide incentive programs based on available regional grant funding that allow customers to try new practices like cover crops and variable rate without requiring extensive paperwork. You can receive these benefits and many others by becoming a valued PARM member. Visit our website, or you can contact me at caitlin@partnershipfarm.org. And with that, I'll turn it back to Julia.
Thank you, Caitlin. As Caitlin mentioned, we provide free resources for ag retailers, grower clients, and consultants. On the left is our continually updated and 4R approved agronomist handbook, available free for download. We develop these locally and regionally for individual locations. Our phosphorus loss reduction wallet cards in the lower left corner can also be ordered for free on our website. To find out more about our incentive programs, click the menu under our Ag Retailer tab on the PARM website. New opportunities arise each year, so make sure to keep coming back for the latest updates. The date of our next webinar in our regular PARM series is targeted for mid-March. Look for announcements in your email, on Facebook, and Twitter. And remember, we take into consideration your suggestions for webinar topics, so be sure to fill out our evaluation form after the webinar. The deadline to take PARM's 2019 Ag Retailer Field Application and Services Survey is this Friday, so please be sure to take it today. Please remember we are offering 1 CCA CEU in nutrient management for taking it. Many of you have received calls from us, and it's been a pleasure speaking to everyone individually. Help us by taking the initiative to get it submitted in order to get your CEUs and nutrient stewardship and aggregate reports. Our annual survey contains vital information the ag industry relies on, including phosphorus and nitrogen retention capacity for various products and services, along with the economic savings from those. Retail profitability trends of different nutrient management products and services, and farmer and dealer barriers to practices like cover crops, subsurface pre-plant, precision agriculture, and more. By participating in the survey, retail locations will receive a confidential nutrient stewardship report detailing nutrient loss reductions, economic savings, and practice adoption comparisons to average data in your state and relative basin. Participants will also receive an aggregate report that incorporates all survey data. Names and locations are kept anonymous. Look for the survey link in our follow-up email and on our website. Please be sure to take only 1 survey per location by January 24th. Please note this survey only applies to custom fertilizer application retailers. And now we'll get the presentation started with Daniel Smith, Southwest Outreach Specialist for the Nutrient and Pest Management Program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison Agricultural and Life Sciences and Division of Extension.
Thanks, Julie and Caitlin. So we'll go ahead and start the presentation. Cover crops and weed management, how to avoid herbicide carryover injury, and then we're going to jump into kind of a second slide deck and show how cover crops can improve weed management. Please provide the questions to the moderators anytime throughout the discussion, throughout the presentation, and we'll have a discussion at the end. So what is herbicide persistence and carryover? Herbicide persistence and carryover is when we see the herbicide injuring a crop after the desired application time period and effectiveness range has ended. So this may result in cover crop damage and stand failure, like the 2 photos in the bottom of the screen show, and this can be avoided by careful selection of herbicides. So some herbicides are going to stick around longer than others and are more influential in injury than other herbicides. Some of the factors that influence this are the chemical properties of the herbicide, or the half-life, the rate of the application, the soil pH. Heavier soil and higher pH equals longer residual time for most herbicide products we see. Organic matter content of the soil can be a huge component of this. The amount of surface plant residue, tillage is going to dilute some of that residue. The temperature and rainfall between herbicide application and the time we want to plant a cover crop. Less rainfall equals longer residual activity. And then microbes in the soil, of course, are going to impact this as well. The 2 photos show radish. These were taken several years ago. on a non-treated area, and then an area where we had herbicide carryover from a herbicide application. So what can we control of these factors? The chemical properties of the herbicide we certainly can control by selecting herbicide products and formulations. The rate of application we have obviously the entire control of, but we don't have any control over many of the other factors. We have some control over the amount of surface plant residue if we do some tillage. Rainfall we may have some influence on if we have some irrigation available to us. And then finally the microbes, we really aren't going to have a whole lot of influence on those, but maybe building some soil health components into our cropping systems, we can have a little bit of influence on a healthier soil, but not necessarily ones that are going to impact this herbicide persistence. So some photos. This is a field that I took some photos of that I was on during a field day, and this is a farm that was planting cover crops after wheat. They had oats, peas, and turnips in this cover crop mix, and this was about a 15-acre field. And they noticed that along the field edges they were missing some cover crop species. In particular, the peas were missing or highly injured. This was concerning to the producer and concerning to some of the folks at the field day, so we decided to dig in a little bit deeper. What had happened was a herbicide carryover event. Husky herbicide had been applied to this field approximately 3 months prior to cover crop establishment. Now what's unique about this case is the farmer cleaned out the sprayer where the actual herbicide carryover injury was occurring. So it was a higher rate of the herbicide than typically seen, and we wouldn't typically expect some of these results. But these photos do a nice job of showing what a herbicide carryover event can look like. We see the picture on the tailgate. The pea plant on the left is nice and healthy, a very elongated stem. The pea plant on the right has very short node length. We look at the photo where my thumb is in. You can see the tendrils of the pea plant are curled up and the leaves are crinkled. That's pretty typical of herbicide carryover injury, or of a herbicide injury in general to a plant species we wouldn't expect. So why is herbicide carryover so complicated? I first started working on this in 2013 in graduate school. It was supposed to be a 2-year project. The research has ended, but the outreach has not. I get a lot of questions about herbicide carryover and working with cover crops. This is because herbicide persistence is somewhat unpredictable. Our crop rotations can bring a great diversity of herbicide products to them to control difficult weeds like waterhemp, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And then our herbicide rotational intervals get somewhat confusing and complicated, and I'll walk through some steps on how to make that a little bit more simple. Weed resistance and troublesome weeds. They're in red because they're really important to make sure that we don't let these weed seeds go to seed out in our fields, but that's going to require using diverse weed management strategies, including cover crops and residual herbicides where appropriate in our crop rotations. So what's your goal of your cover crop? This is where we always start when we work with producers on looking at cover crops. And then working with residual herbicides is a very similar role as what's your goals. So when we're looking at using a cover crop, maybe it's for soil conservation, maybe it's for weed suppression, water management, and conservation. Those are all pretty easily obtained while using residual herbicides in your cropping rotation. What gets a little bit more complicated is when we want to use these cover crops for a forage crop, because there's going to be rotational restrictions on these cover crop, on these herbicide applications to those cover crop species. Interseeding gets a little more complicated because we think about the time between herbicide application and the time we plant this cover crop is very close together, usually about 30 days. If we're doing an in-season application at say V5, if it's a little bit later, say an aerial application, it's still only going to be 60 to 90 days at the most. And then are we going to use any cover crop besides rye? Winter rye works phenomenally well as a cover crop. Our research has indicated that it works phenomenally well in cropping systems where we use herbicides. A lot of other cover crops are a little bit more complicated, and we'll cover that data. So why does this matter? Why do we get so many questions about this? Well, in 2015, SARE and CITC conducted a survey asking farmers what their biggest challenges were with cover crops. About 45% of respondents indicated that establishment was the biggest challenge. We look at some of these other challenges, yield reduction in falling crop, nitrogen management concerns, the cover crop becomes a weed, there's no measurable economic return, some pretty common concerns when we think about what our producers are asking us. But we move down to the very bottom, establishing cover crops, 45%, this may be contributed to herbicide carryover. We can think of that as definitely a factor that influences that establishment period. Moving on to another survey, this is a little bit newer data. This is from the same survey, but the 2017 report. And this is when we looked at what's the biggest challenge to cover crops, and farmers indicated that 80% indicated that cover crops stand. So establishing a cover crop was the biggest concern. Again, herbicide carryover can be a huge influential factor over establishing a cover crop. So we're going to move into the trial that we did several years ago at Arlington Agricultural Research Station in Arlington, Wisconsin, and talk about what we saw and how that can relate to folks like yourselves out in the field, or as an agronomist, how you can help your clients deal with some of these herbicide carryover issues. So our trial looked at determining if commonly applied corn and soybean herbicides adversely affects cover crops, dry biomass, stand, percent green cover, and DBI of fall seeded cover crops. So we're looking at the health of the cover crop, we're looking at how much green cover we get, and then how much growth we get of the cover crop. So these are corn and soybean trials. They were established with glyphosate-resistant cultivars at Arlington Agricultural Research Farm in Arlington, Wisconsin. Prairie soils, very good place to do agricultural research. It was a randomized complete block design with 4 replications, and each trial included a non-treated control. We did this study in 2013 and 2014. The important info: what cover crops did we plant? We planted crimson clover, 2 varieties of annual ryegrass, winter rye or cereal rye as some call it, an oats pea mixture where it was 70% oats, 30% pea, and then tillage radish. The plots were 10 by 50 feet. That way we could establish many different treatments to look at many different herbicides, and we'll cover that in a couple slides. It was important to note that we managed all the weed species in this trial with several post applications of glyphosate. Glyphosate does not carry over and does not cause carryover injury, and we control all the weeds. That way we'd have a uniform area to work and plant our cover crops in the fall. Pretty typical cover crops for southern Wisconsin. We chopped the corn for silage corn. That way we could have the closest amount of time between herbicide application and planting of our cover crop species. So we usually planted our cover crops around September 15th each year. We had several different treatments in corn and soybeans. Our corn treatments, we looked at applying a pre-herbicide, an early post-herbicide at V2 corn, and a late post at V4. These are all residual products. So these herbicides were intended to control weeds after application for the most part. Many of our treatments included a residual component. These herbicides were applied at the latest labeled timing. So for example, if herbicide A was labeled for a pre and a V2 application, we chose the V2 application. That would be our E-post timing. Corn treatments, fairly common herbicides for southern Wisconsin use in corn grain. And then soybean treatments, we had 2 treatment timings, a pre and then an early post. Same as the corn treatments, we applied those at the latest labeled timings. Again, some fairly common products that we typically see used. So what data did we collect? We collected cover data, percent green cover data, stand counts, and biomass. We're going to show the data for some percent green cover and biomass. And then we did biomass samples. That way we could come back and correlate how much biomass was produced based on these treatments. Percent cover calculation procedure. I like to cover this because there's a really nice app out there on the marketplace now. In the App Store, you can find it as Canopio. It's a nice way to use out in the field to see how much percent green cover you have, and that was developed in Oklahoma with the university down there. We used a little bit more rigorous approach where we used the computer software program SigmaScan to do our percent green cover estimates, but percent green cover is really important to estimate in cover crops when we're looking at comparing injury levels. Oftentimes we see factors that influence herbicide carryover may not be necessarily showing up as symptomology out in the field if we have a whole field of cover crops, but if we compare a non-treated area to a treated area, sometimes we can start to see some differences. Percent green cover is a good tool to compare those. 2013-2014 winter rye, so now some results. Winter rye was the only cover crop that wasn't negatively impacted by any of the corn and soybean treatments. This was both years, phenomenal stands of winter rye, somewhat diverse growing conditions. We'll cover that before we end the results section. All the other cover crops had one herbicide at least injure them and reduce the biomass, the percent green cover, or the NDVI. So a little bit of a snapshot of the results. We saw obviously no injury in winter rye, so that's the green column there. Red's going to indicate injury in this graph. We have our cover crop species at the top. We have radish, crimson clover, annual ryegrass, and oats pea mixture. And then you can start to see how some of these herbicides injure different cover crop species. We have our corn and our soybean herbicides, and then they're all listed as active ingredients instead of trade names. In 2014, little to no herbicide carryover was seen in any of the cover crops. This was likely due to more precipitation events and warmer temperatures in 2014, likely led to greater pesticide dissipation and degradation. The risk of herbicide injury is present when residual herbicides are used in a cropping system, though. So that's kind of our disclaimer, and weather conditions from the time the herbicide application is made until the cover crop is established will influence when the injury occurs. So that's a really good take-home message. You can use a really good residual herbicide program in 1 year and not see injury on your fall planted cover crops, but on the next year, these really good residual herbicide products can really hurt our cover crop establishment. Some photos to illustrate this. So we have our king annual ryegrass % green cover. Our non-treated plot had 66%, and you can see how some of these other herbicides significantly reduce the % green cover of these cover crop species. And this is annual ryegrass, 66% green cover planted after silage corn. We would expect that to be pretty typical. As far as the height goes, that was about 4 to 6 inches in height. Our oats pea mixture. Our oats did phenomenally well in 2013, and they struggled a little bit more in 2014. When we plant cover crops after silage corn in southern Wisconsin, we have some pretty decent weather for maybe 2 or 3 weeks, and then our temperatures really fall off at night. So we'd expect decent establishment, but not a huge amount of biomass accumulation out of some of these cover crops. That's why we really favor winter rye for some of these applications, because it's going to overwinter and provide a lot of nice biomass in the spring. Our non-treated plot for oats and pea mixture had 61% green cover, and then you can see how some of our other herbicide treatments injured the cover crops. Our radish treatments. So we got very little above ground growth and below ground growth out of our radish after silage corn. Our non-treated plots had 54%, and then you can see how some of our other herbicides injured radish. The injury there with rimsulfuron with 41%. In a producer's field, you may not even notice that. Just a slight injury. It was significant in our study, but again, maybe not something you notice on a producer's field, but something to take note of. Obviously, 18 and 22% would be very easy to notice. Even if the cover crop was part of a mix, you would really see not very much radish out there. 2014. We didn't see any injury on any of the cover crops from any of the herbicide treatments. This was a big surprise. We're going to talk about why that was such a surprise in the next couple slides, but we didn't see any injury at all. We had a really nice stands of cover crops. The photo there on the bottom of the slide shows our cover crop plots. You can see no differences. If you look at a 2013 plot photo, you'd see those plots that were really hurt by those herbicide applications. Several graphs to help illustrate these injuries a little bit better. These were put together this year by Dr. Maxwell Oliveira to help illustrate our presentation, our project. We're currently working on a manuscript to help get out to our producers and get out to the scientific community on this study. So if we look at our graph, this is cover crop % green cover and visual injury rating approximately 6 weeks after cover crop planting following soybean herbicides in 2013-2014. So we have 2013 data on the top, 2014 on the bottom for the 2 sets of graphs, and then we have our cover crop species. So we have bruiser annual ryegrass, crimson clover, king annual rye, oats, radish, and winter rye. We start on the far left-hand side of this chart with bruiser annual ryegrass. You can see in 2013, the black dot with the line around it is the % cover, and then the green is % visual injury rating. So that's where we went out and we evaluated injury out in the field visually. And the farther to the right any of those results are, means the more, the higher percentage we see. So for our cover, that would be a good thing. For our injury, that would be a bad thing. The more % injury we see, obviously, would mean the less % cover we see. So the easiest way to look at that is if we come down here to the S-metolachlor plus mesotrione plus glyphosate treatment, we have a cover that's very low, and we have an injury that's slightly elevated. We move on to the corn slide. Again, very similar results. We look at some of the highlights on this side. Our non-treated winter rye, for some reason, showed that we had a little bit of injury in this particular treatment. That's an outlier. We're going to look at the data a little bit more closely. So if anybody catches that right away, we're going to dive into that a little bit closer. But if we start to look at some of these other treatments, we do see some injury here and there, but nothing to get too excited about in 2014, as we talked about earlier. So we move on to the weather. Our precipitation was quite variable between the 2 years. 2013, we had several large rain events after application. We had 5.5 inches of rain in 2013 May and 7.4 in 2013 June. Comparing that to 2014, we got very little rain after application to activate the herbicide, but then after the herbicide was applied, we got some pretty steady rainfall totals. 2013, on average, we got higher amounts of precipitation compared to 2014, but the 2014 events came at very targeted timings, and they were usually 1 or 2 rain events, where 2013 rain events were somewhat spread out in smaller amounts, each one was. So our daily high temperatures, this is important because we think about temperature as a factor in herbicide breakdown, and it definitely can influence herbicide carryover. The temperatures shown only indicate days between the herbicide application and the cover crop. The monthly average is highlighted. So the monthly average is what's in blue or red, depending on 2013 or 2014. We see some really big spreads in May, where our high in 2014 got all the way to 79 for the month. Our low is 70. And then we see some data to look at a little bit closer in September. It was 77 degrees in 2013 and 70 in 2014. This can help to explain why we saw such more cover crop growth in 2013 as 2014. In 2013, we saw pretty good cover crop growth out of all the species we saw. In 2014, we saw very little growth out of all the cover crop species. So what's our take-home message? Several herbicides are going to injure the cover crops based on the year and based on the conditions at application, based on all those influential factors we talked about at the beginning of the presentation. They all have the potential to reduce the establishment and the percent green cover of the cover crop species. The severity of the injury is going to be determined by the weather, the cover crop species, and the specific herbicide combination. A couple of photos to help illustrate that injury a little bit better. The photo on the left is 2013. You can see some of those injury symptomology throughout those plots. The photo on the right shows the plots in 2014. A lot of less cover crop growth in 2014. You can see that. All right, so this is a slide that was compiled by West Central Distribution, and I wanted to share this because I was part of the team that helped provide the data to West Central last summer. This is all university data from the University of Missouri, Penn State, and the University of Wisconsin that provided this data. And this is kind of a nice overview. I highly recommend everyone interested in using herbicides in their crop rotations and incorporating cover crops, look at the information from the University of Missouri and Kevin Bradley's lab, and then look at Penn State and the work from John Wallace on those. Two universities have great work on herbicide carryover and specific cropping systems and crop rotations. We look at some of these herbicides, fairly common herbicides. The green indicates that more tolerant range when planted 90 days after application, dependent on other variables. The yellow is kind of a caution, a little bit more injury, and the orange is a little bit more injury yet. We look at the cover crop species: crimson clover, winter pea, hairy vetch, rapeseed, radish, turnip, annual ryegrass, oats, rye, and winter wheat. Sorry. See some pretty common themes. For this compiled set of data, rye was only injured by one herbicide. Wheat, obviously very similar to rye, injured by a few more. And then we look at annual ryegrass, radish, turnip, they were injured by a few more herbicides. All right, to share some more recent data. Several years ago, Dr. Rodrigo Worley started the University of Wisconsin as the new weed scientist and has brought on several great grad students to work on some cover crops and cropping system work. And this particular work here is on soil residual activity of pre-emergent soybean herbicides in Wisconsin. And this is by Victor Ribeiro and then of course led by Dr. Worley. He's Victor's Rodrigo's grad student. And this was part of a study that was done at Lancaster Agricultural Research Station and Arlington Agricultural Research Station. And herbicide treatments were put out in the field, residual herbicides targeting water hemp for the Lancaster work, and then Victor would go out and soil sample with a bulb auger. So he was taking soil out of the field to then plant several species of plants in the greenhouse to look at the potential of the soil activity and injury on these species. So Victor planted Palmer amaranth, winter rye, radish, and giant foxtail in the greenhouse in these soils. And he collected this soil at different dates and timings. So we move on to the photo slide here. I apologize for that. What Victor did was he planted these cover crop species in these little flat containers. And this soil was collected at application timing, so the day we applied the herbicides in Lancaster, that was late May. 10 days after treatment, 20 days after treatment, 30 days after treatment, 40 days after treatment, and 50 days after treatment. And you can see how that injury level is somewhat variable depending on what herbicide, and the herbicides are listed down at the bottom of the screen, and then the days after treatment along with the growing degree days are listed on the right-hand side of the screen. So if you look at the very front row there of data, you can see the winter rye and the foxtail survived quite a few of those herbicides. The broadleafs were a little bit more injured by some of those herbicide applications. And then you move up through the photo throughout the days, you can see quite a few of those did quite well after that time period had passed. Again, winter rye, you can say, stood out in the study as definitely being able to survive some of those herbicide applications and that day length between application. We think about how long typically we plant some of our cover crop species, though, is going to be 90 to 120 days. So what can we do to assess this out in the field? A bioassay. So a field versus greenhouse bioassay looks at collecting soil from the field and then growing a cover crop species or even another crop in the greenhouse to see how it will do after that herbicide's been applied. So for a field example, we'd look at applying our herbicide to that entire field, and then we decide, well, I want to grow winter rye as a cover crop. You would select a small area in that field to go out and hand sow some winter rye into, and then observe it for several weeks to see if it's going to have any negative interaction with that herbicide that was applied out there in the landscape. For a greenhouse one, we'd have to collect some of that soil. We'd put it in a warm place, in a window in our home, a window in our office. If we had a greenhouse or access to one, that'd be even better. And then we'd plant a reasonable amount of cover crop seed in that soil, and we'd observe for injury. It's important to note that this does not replace the rotational restrictions that are a legal component of our herbicide labels. This is just simply if we want to see what's out there in the field and what is the potential for possible injury. So moving on into some of those legal aspects of herbicide applications and using cover crops, it's going to be important to look at cover crops versus a forage crop. I'm going to define a cover crop as when we're not harvesting any biomass. A forage crop is when we're harvesting that biomass. Cover crops can be utilized as forage. Some of them make really good forage. As we know, winter rye is a phenomenal forage crop when harvested properly and managed for forage quality. Most pesticide labels may not have cover crop data and only forage crop data. This has been changing the last couple seasons. We've seen some of the companies register new herbicide labels with updated language for cover crops, and we'll show an example of that in the next slide. But we want to plan for pesticide applications and the restrictions before time. So we want to have a plan of what herbicides we're going to use and what cover crops are we going to try and use. So our rotational herbicide restrictions. The rotation data is a legal requirement from the time between herbicide application and harvest. This can be used as a guide for cover crop establishment, but if no harvest is planned, it's not a legal requirement. So that's an important note. This can be used as a guide for cover crop establishment, but if we're not harvesting, this is not necessarily a legal requirement. But you have to look at each herbicide label individually because the language is very specific. First label example, it states, do not rotate to food or feed crops other than those listed below. For all crops not listed, wait 12 months following the last application. Barley, oats, rye, and wheat may be planted 4.5 months following treatment. So that's a legal requirement. We have to wait 4.5 months after that herbicide was applied to plant those. Moving on to the second example, this herbicide doesn't give specific crop language, but it has a small grain section. For those herbicides, we have to wait 11 and 18 months if we're going to use those small grains for food or feed purposes. Moving on to a herbicide label that has specific cover crop information on it. This is a section in the herbicide label, and it says that planting of cover crops in fields treated with the herbicide is allowed as long as these cover crops are not grazed by livestock nor harvested for food. Significant injury may occur. So there's two important things that we need to look for in a herbicide label. We need to look for those rotational requirements, and we need to look for cover crop language in the herbicides. The best way to do this is to look at a herbicide online and go through and search the documents for keywords like rotational restrictions and cover crops and forage use. Those will be our legal guidelines for cover crop use after residual herbicides. So for an example to illustrate this a little bit better, we have our herbicide A. It's pre-emergent herbicide applied May 1st. Herbicide B is also a pre-emergent herbicide. Photo here, we're planting green into a nice stand of winter rye. 4.5 months go by. It's September 15th. We're legal to plant a forage crop such as winter rye after that herbicide application on May 1st with herbicide A. Herbicide B, though, has an 11th month rotational restriction. So we can legally plant a forage crop on April 1st the following year, or we can plant our cover crop as long as we assume the risks of potential herbicide injury, but we cannot harvest that for forage or feed value. We have to terminate the cover crop, no harvest of that grain or forage. So rotational restrictions, more information. Do a herbicide label search. You've got to read and follow and understand the herbicide label if we're going to be using herbicides in our crop rotations. But we want to do some searching when we dig into those herbicide labels for specific cover crop language, such as the rotational interval, restriction interval, cover crops, and crop rotation. Extension publications on these topics provide a high-level overview, and they are not a substitution for the label. You have to read the herbicide label. A lot of good information is contained in those labels. This is a publication we put together, an updated publication from a really popular herbicide rotational restriction publication that was put out in 2014. We updated this in 2019. Myself, along with Richard Frost in the Nutrient Pest Management Program, were the primary editors for this, along with Maxwell, Ryan, and Dr. Worley, of course. Again, great publication. You can find it by just simply Googling herbicide rotation restrictions, UW-Madison. An example from that publication, we have about 220 herbicides we went through and we read the labels for. A lot of reading obviously went into this project, a lot of time, and we listed then the information we thought was relevant for producers to begin a starting point for looking at herbicide rotation. So this is the maximum rotational restriction interval for labeled herbicides in Wisconsin. So we only use products that were labeled in Wisconsin. We look at our very first product. We have 2,4-D here. We searched the document for bioassay required or recommended. So remember we talked about how to do a bioassay. Some of the herbicide labels recommend or require doing one before planting the next crop within a certain amount of time. So that's good information to know. Was there cover crop language included? Yes or no? This is a no, obviously. And then our common Wisconsin crops. What's our corn, field, and silage rotation restrictions? 14 days after application. Soybeans is 30 and alfalfa is 30 days. And then we move into our small grains and grasses. 30 days was obviously the rotational interval for most of these, and then we also use the max duration for some of these other species that aren't listed on there. So a good publication to start referencing as a starting point, but again, it doesn't replace the herbicide label. So what about interseeding? Interseeding gets even trickier because we want to interseed into a weed-free crop. So we've got to make a herbicide application or a field cultivation pass, row cultivation pass through to clean up those weeds. But we have to know and target our most troublesome weeds in interseeding. So if we have water hemp, we're going to have to target water hemp in our crop rotations. This may mean moving away from a broadleaf cover crop to interseed. Really nice information I included here on the slides from Penn State. They have a really nice set of research data online. You can Google Penn State interseeding, it'll come up. They have a whole web page devoted to interseeding successes. I highly recommend looking at that information before trying to interseed. We've interseeded for the past couple of years in Wisconsin. We've unfortunately relied upon glyphosate alone for our weed management strategy. That's a bad thing because we know that relying on one product for too long is going to be an influential factor for resistance. We've also done some row cultivation, a great way again, depending on your goal and your cropping system, but we didn't see any impacts in our weed control system on our interseeding, but we always were weed free at the time of interseeding, because once we've interseeded a cover crop and that cover crop germinates, we don't have any other tools to go in there and terminate the weeds without harming the cover crop in many cases. Last note on interseeding, if you're going to have a broadleaf weed control program, probably rely on a grass cover crop. If you're going to have a primarily grass weed control program, probably rely on a broadleaf cover crop. But do the research on the herbicide label, do the research on the extension websites, and look at some of your options. So why winter rye? Winter rye keeps coming up in this presentation. It's kind of a really noteworthy cover crop. It's because it's versatile in the way that we can use it as a cover crop species. Winter rye is going to do really well in our northern climates. It's going to be able to overwinter. It's going to be able to provide feed for our livestock species. We're going to be able to plant green into it for a great mat for weed control, which is the second portion of this presentation. Winter rye has done phenomenally well in our crop rotations with our residual herbicides, and it's really a nice cover crop to work with. Some management challenges, some termination challenges, but those can be overcome with a little bit of research. Corn, soybean rotational restrictions. Nice photo of water hemp. Water hemp's pretty widespread in the north central region. We have to control water hemp. We can't let it go to seed. That makes using cover crops a little bit trickier because those residual herbicides are going to stick around maybe a little bit longer, and depending on the year, really too long to use some of our cover crop species. Think back to winter rye. Forage considerations. If you're going to use your cover crop for forage, either grazing or a mechanical harvest, you always have to read, follow, and understand the herbicide rotation restrictions for whatever herbicide you're applying, but for forage use, this gets particularly important and can get particularly confusing and complicated. Winter rye is going to be a really good bet for this use. The research has shown that winter rye is a great cover crop for forage value. Remember your troublesome weeds. If you have water hemp in these cropping rotations, it's still going to be difficult to control in your forage rotations, and it's going to be even more complicated by those rotational restrictions. So what corn herbicides are often injurious to cover crop species? So this was information that I went through and I gleaned out. Important to note that Purdue also did a study the same as ours at the same timing. So some of this incorporates their data as well. But we have to think about when our cover crops are going to be established. We're growing silage corn. We're pretty limited on the cover crop species that we can plant. Probably going to go back to winter rye. Interseeding at V4 is going to be a little bit more complicated. We have to do the research on the herbicides we're going to use. We have to do the research on the cover crops we're going to use. Not all cover crops are going to be good for interseeding. Overseeding is about 50% dry down. For corn, this would be an aerial application or a high clearance sprayer application where we're applying that seed, letting it fall down in the canopy and germinate. Fairly limited on species again that is going to work in that system. And then finally, after harvest, winter rye is going to do phenomenally well if we can get it planted in a timely manner and get good seed to soil contact. Winter rye and cereal rye, almost no herbicide issues. Soybeans, we have to think about cover crop establishment timing. Interseeding, probably not. We've done some research on this, maybe 30-inch rows, you can get it to work one out of every other year or so. Not recommended at this time. Overseeding, R7 leaf drop, again, a broadcast application. We've seen some phenomenal success in our research studies and on producers' farms using this. Maybe a way to use cover crops and then fall. We're looking at that fall seeded winter rye again. Winter rye, almost no herbicide issues again. So that's kind of the take-home message for our corn and soybean rotations. So how do I prevent herbicide carryover? Target the most troublesome weeds that you have in your cropping rotations. plant the opposite cover crop species. That's the most simple way, potentially. Target the appropriate residual herbicide chemistry. Use site knowledge to your advantage to control the variables. So if you have higher soil pHs, higher organic matters, that type of thing, plant winter rye. Increase the seeding rate, lighter soils, lower organic matters, and high pH fields. These are going to be our troublesome fields that are going to be a little bit more tricky to manage herbicide carryover. So with that, we're going to transition now into the weed management aspect of cover crops. So how do cover crops improve weed management? These are two photos taken at Arlington Agriculture Research Station, just kind of part of a side study that we did. The literature will show us that cover crops do a really nice job of suppressing weeds, and we've got some data to support that. So the photo on the left, just a standard soybean plot, no herbicides were applied. The photo on the right is winter rye with soybeans growing in that. The system that this was established in, the photo on the left was a conventional field, no-till planted, fairly clean because it was after silage corn. The photo on the right was winter rye that was terminated 2 weeks before planting, and we planted soybeans into that winter rye. Could have done planting green, we could have done maybe some forage harvest, we could have done a couple different ways to manage our winter rye stand, but we chose just to terminate it several weeks ahead of time. Really nice weed management. This was in a silage corn soybean rotation field at the Arlington Agricultural Research Station. We saw common lamb's quarters, eastern black nightshade, velvet leaf horseweed, common ragweed, common dandelion, woolly cupgrass, giant foxtail, ladystem smartweed, wild buckwheat, redroot pigweed, yellow foxtail, barnyard grass, and large crabgrass, all suppressed by that winter rye. Winter rye was seeded at 120 pounds per acre. That's important to note because we want a higher seeding rate if we're going to rely on winter rye alone for our weed management. In organic systems, they typically use 3+ bushels of winter rye to do like a crimping into that type of thing. In our corn rotation, our silage corn field, very similar results. We saw some fairly common weed suppressed. You can see the photo on the left is a non-treated plot, photo on the right, that winter rye. You peel back that canopy of that winter rye, you see virtually no weeds. And this was in about late May is when these photos were taken. So what does the research say? Well, if you type into Google Scholar cover crop weed suppression, you get 69,000 results. There's quite a few results from the past 2 years on studies like this, but there's a few studies that were done 15, 20 years ago even on this topic. Fairly common in organic systems to use cover crops as a weed suppression tool. Look at that research and see how you can apply it to your farm. Really good work has been done on this topic. Some more work from the University of Wisconsin and Dr. Worley's Cropping Systems Weed Science Lab was by another graduate student. This started last year by Colby Grant, and he started this project with Dr. Worley to look at the influence of soil management practices on weed control, herbicide fate, and crop productivity. So I want to credit again Colby for this work and Dr. Worley's lab and thank them for sharing this project and sharing Victor's research with me. So the introduction to the study. The objective was to improve the understanding of the effects that soil management practices, conventional till, no-till, and no-till plus cover crops have on weed control, and the residual herbicide fate and crop productivity in corn soybean rotation. We're going to cover the data for the cover crops work. We're not going to look at the residual herbicide fate work. Hypothesis was that soil management practices influence weed control, fate of pre-emergent herbicides, and crop productivity. So what did the study look like? These were corn and soybean studies at Arlington and Lancaster Agricultural Research Stations. Randomized complete block with 4 replications again, fairly common treatment sizes, and then our soil management strategies included tillage. So this would be a fall chisel plow plus a spring field cultivation, a no-till treatment where we're just no-tilling into the stubble from the last harvest, and then cover crops with 4 methods and timings of cover crop termination. So we looked at terminating it several weeks ahead of time. We looked at terminating at planting. We looked at terminating with a forage harvest, and then we looked at terminating 2 weeks after planting for a simulated planting green scenario. And then we had herbicide treatments to make this a factorial study where we had pre versus no pre herbicide. So all of our Soil management strategies were either done with a pre-herbicide or without a pre-herbicide. And these are our timings of when these occurred at the Lancaster Agriculture Research Station. All right, so for our treatments, again, we had a residual herbicide component on our pre-treatments. All treatments received a burn down and then a post-emergent application. You can see those on your screen depending on what crop you're looking at. Fairly common products for southern Wisconsin. We used cereal rye as our cover crop. We drilled this at about 60 pounds per acre, or 64 kilograms per hectare. The fall chisel, springfield cultivation was our tillage treatments, and then all of our treatments were applied with a backpack sprayer. Except for our post-emergent application, our blanket treatments went on with a tractor sprayer. Weed control was evaluated by visually rating the plots 0 to 100, or 100% equals 0 weeds in the plot. 0 would be a very weedy check plot. Conducted before the post applications, and then of course the lab harvested the yield with a small plot compound. So what's our cover crop biomass look like? We planted these on October 16th in Arlington, October 23rd in Lancaster, for both our corn following soybeans and our soybeans following corn rotations. So it's important to note, for clarity purposes, we're doing treatments side by side, corn and soybeans in the same year. So we're using two study fields at each location to do this study. That way we can look at corn and soybeans over the course of several years. We look at our cover crop biomass. We had a fairly decent stand of winter rye at early, even though the graph doesn't make it look like it's a ton of biomass. There was several hundred pounds out there. We look at the late termination timing though, we had about 3,500 kilograms per hectare of biomass out there on the winter rye at the Lancaster Research Station. Arlington Ag Research Station, we planted these cover crops a little bit earlier. We had about 6,000 pounds of biomass, or 6,000 kilograms per hectare of biomass out on the field. So a tremendous amount of biomass out there in the field, and that'd be pretty typical. We'd expect come early to mid-May, depending on what the weather looks like and our temperatures are, that we'd see a tremendous amount of biomass be produced by winter rye between mid-May and first part of June. First part of June, typically around Memorial Day, is when we see winter rye move into the reproductive stages of growth, and full enthesis occurs usually about that time. That's when we would crimp it if we were using crimped rye for our weed management strategy. Looking at weed control, this is visual weed control data. We see fairly comparable but significantly different weed control based on using a pre-emergent herbicide or not. So we look at our first graph here. We have a significant difference between not using a pre-emergent herbicide and using a pre-emergent herbicide for both locations. Pre-emergent herbicides enhance weed control at both sites. Pre-herbicides were more effective at Lancaster, and you'd see that difference right here. We look at the visual weed control in corn. For our tillage strategies, you can see some significant differences. The letters at the top of the graph indicates our mean separations. So our no-till plus cover crop is our A, that'd be our highest, and then we have all the way down to no-till. So this would be our percent weed control. No-till without a pre-emergent herbicide plus a cover crop, and then we have our no-till with or without a pre-emergent herbicide based on the color of the graph again. It's important to note all of our pre-emergent herbicide treatments, regardless of tillage, were statistically the same for weed control. Our tillage, we see a little bit differences, but again, for the most part, they are the same as well statistically. Pre-herbicide improved weed control for tillage, no-till early termination, and planting termination timing. Looking at corn yield, our corn looked pretty good at Lancaster Agriculture Research Farm for this study. We look at corn grain yield. Our highest corn grain yield was produced at Arlington, and our no-till and no-till plus early termination treatments, our no-till plus cover crops terminated at planting timing. We look at mean separation for these and statistical differences. We saw some statistical decreases in yield for tillage, no-till planting plus cover crops for forage harvest, and no-till plus cover crops terminated late for corn grain. Some surprising take-homes: no-till out-yielded tilled ground at Arlington Agricultural Research Station. 1 year of data. Stay tuned to see what that story looks like over the course of 4 years. Pretty promising for those of us that are working on soil conservation and using cover crops as a component of weed management. We look at Lancaster. Lancaster tillage out-yielded all the other treatments. Not surprised by that. We see that. That's fairly typical. Also remember, though, that these studies were established 1 year prior to this, so we're not seeing a long-term effect of no-till. Again, fairly similar yields, statistically the same for all the other treatments. We look at soybean weed control. With the pre-emergent herbicide, again, very similar story to the corn data. Very good weed control when using a pre-emergent herbicide. When we incorporate cover crops into those systems, we see very comparable weed control as to using the herbicide. So statistically, they're the same as using the cover crop or the herbicide. That's a really promising result. Again, this is 1 year of data. We'll see this moving forward. Hopefully these trends continue. Soybean yield, similar story. At Arlington Agricultural Research Station, we didn't see any yield difference in any of these treatments. We look at Lancaster yield, same thing. We didn't see any statistical differences in this yield data. Higher grain yield at Lancaster compared to Arlington. We had one treatment that I know went above 80 bushels per acre at Lancaster. So some really good soybean yields. Soybeans are low-hanging fruit when you look at using cover crops for weed control. That's going to be the easiest place to start. It's going to be by far the most flexible. That's what we recommend to producers, is if you're going to use cover crops and you want to use them for weed control, plant winter rye after silage or grain corn, plant soybeans into that residue. Phenomenal weed control as the data is shown, and no yield penalty. Corn gets a little more complicated. That's cover crops 201, 301 level of knowledge, but it can be done. Many producers do planting green with corn successfully, but they have to think about their termination timings and their soil fertility management. You want to have good soil fertility levels going into cover crops, and then you want to manage accordingly. So finally, to wrap things up, I wanted to plug a couple of publications that we've produced in the last couple of years. Interseeding cover crops and row cultivated corn. A group of us at the University of Wisconsin put this publication together based on some research that we did on interseeding at the Arlington Agricultural Research Station. Some really good information, general information on interseeding. Cover Crops 101 is kind of the new standard for cover crop knowledge in Wisconsin. It's an A series publication from the University of Wisconsin Division of Extension A4176. Really good resource. It's about 8 pages long. Provides general cover crops knowledge. And then finally, that herbicide rotational restrictions for cover and forage cropping systems I talked about earlier. So with that, we'll open it up to questions. I encourage you emailing and calling specific questions as well. Or if you're watching this online, feel free to reach out those ways as well.
All right, thanks so much for sharing, Daniel. We are going to do the Q&A now, and we're going to give attendees 1 minute to submit their questions. So please enter your questions into the question box on your screen, and we'll be back on to answer those questions in approximately 1 minute. Okay, we're going to give attendees another minute or so to keep sending questions in. There's a lot coming in still, so we'll let you keep sending them. All right, we're going to get started with the Q&A now. Feel free to keep sending questions in as we go along. All right, so the first question we're going to get started with is, I noticed on some field photos showing injury symptoms, there is a tendency to have less injury over the old corn row. Is this a function of crop canopy interception or differences in soil breakdown of the chemical?
We didn't collect any data, unfortunately, on that aspect. That's a great observation, but on a field scale, when we're actually out in the field, the photos may be a little bit deceiving due to maybe some shadows and such from the residue, but unfortunately, we didn't see any differences because of that breakdown in that residue. Potentially, maybe an interaction of that root zone, but scientifically, nothing to report on as far as that, unfortunately.
Okay, the next question is, Dan, can you speak on why weed management was so good in the corn planting green treatment, but yield did not follow in Colby's study? Is this a nutrient management issue?
Correct. So we managed these treatments identically for nutrients. So we had those at optimum levels based on Wisconsin fertility standards from extension. So we managed all the treatments to have optimum levels. We didn't do any treatment-specific management for nitrogen. We did see some impacts of that nitrogen tie-up of that rye residue on the corn plants, and those yields do show some differences in that when it's a little bit too soon to credit certain yield reductions to certain attributes. But when talking to producers, nitrogen management is certainly important when we look at these systems. Of course, rye is going to have a high carbon and nitrogen ratio, and we look at trying to manage that breakdown. Future work could be evaluating the use of starter fertilizer in those treatments, and then looking at using some later season applications of nitrogen, say doing an application with the planter and then maybe a V5 side dress application to help overcome that breakdown and release of that nitrogen.
Okay, next question is, what is the recommended rate of N to apply at planting when planting into rye cover crop, especially when rye is terminated late?
So we don't have a university recommendation for that particular system, unfortunately, yet. There's been some preliminary research done in those systems, and I would advise attendees to look into some research done by Dr. Matt Ruark, and his soils webpage is easily found if you Google Dr. Matt Ruark, UW soils. He's done some preliminary research and released a report on using winter rye and nitrogen management. As far as overall, we typically see Wisconsin producers using about 160 pounds of nitrogen, and that can be strategically applied in these systems, some at planting time and then some at side dress time. But again, we don't have a university recommendation at this time for that system, unfortunately.
Okay, next question is there any difference or recommendations for drilling, airflow, or broadcast spreading cover crops?
So there is. We typically see when we change seeding methods, we see increasing seeding rates. Those broadcast about 10% the amount of seed that we would want to drill the seed at. So the easiest way to kind of talk about this would be to look at an example. If we look at using winter rye, we typically advise using 40 to 60 pounds of winter rye after silage corn if we're just planting this for a cover crops purpose, say soil building, controlling erosion. We move into a broadcast seeding, then we typically look at using 60 to 90 pounds of seed. So a slight increase. Typically we see 10% increase, but we want to also look at what kind of weather we're going to get after we broadcast that seed on the surface, and if we're going to do any incorporation of that seed. Any incorporation, we can reduce that recommendation down as well.
Next question is, are any of the trials going to be long-term studies, i.e. 10 years or longer in duration?
Great question. So at this point, we've laid out a plan for Colby's work to go 4 years. I would really like to see that go 10, 15, 20 years, turn into a long-term rotational study. We're using a couple acres of land at the Lancaster Agrocultural Research Station. The station loves having the work done there. We got some really positive feedback this summer from producers and agronomists who came out and saw the plots. So stay tuned. Hopefully we can keep them out there for a long time to see what kind of changes we see over the long term.
Okay, next question is, can you restate what cover crops might work interseeding into corn when corn is knee-high?
Yes, so our research has shown that red clover and annual ryegrass have worked pretty well in those systems, and then winter rye has worked quite variably. We've also tried crimson, berseem, oats and peas, and radish interseeded. None of those species work. I say that because they don't produce above ground biomass and they're not present at the time of harvest. They all may germinate, but they don't stick around throughout the summer. Key to interseeding is you want the species to look tough when we interseed it because it's not going to compete then with the corn. Radish did quite well in an interseeded system. However, we didn't see the benefits that we'd typically see out of radish. We saw quite a bit of above ground growth, and we saw some competition then with that above ground growth, and we really didn't see that tuber being produced. That's why we kind of shy away from recommending radish unless maybe it's in a mix at a very low seeding rate. Stick with red clover, stick with annual ryegrass. That's where we've seen the success.
Okay, next question is, what have been your experiences with rolling cereal rye with a smooth roller versus crimper roller?
So the disclaimer, I've never actually rolled rye. The picture on the slide right now is me actually interseeding. I've never rolled rye. I've been to several field days where they've done it. I've been out in the field where they've been rolling the rye at the trials that are done by Dr. Aaron Silva at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I've seen that firsthand. The chevron pattern that's on that roller crimper is going to be really important to actually crimp the stem of the rye. That's going to terminate the rye. It also has to be done at full enthesis or at pollination to actually kill the rye plant. Any earlier, you have the potential for that rye to stand up. With a flat roller would be fine in a conventional system where we're going to go back in and terminate that rye later on, but with that flat roller, it has the tendency that rye can stand back up because you're not breaking the stem.
Okay, next question is, we use a lot of broadleaves ahead of corn, rape, turnips, forage kale, crimson clover, etc. What residual products should we stay away from? We apply corn herbicides pre-emergent.
Great question. Julie, did they have the planting timing of that cover crop, or is it just ahead of corn?
They did not have the timing.
Okay. So I would look at two resources. I would look at this list to see if any of the products that you're currently using are on there. I'd also look at the herbicide label a little bit closer, and then finally do a little bit of research on our website. I would be glad to take a question through email that has a little bit more details in that, but as far as a particular herbicide program to follow, I'd still stick with a residual herbicide component in that program for our troublesome weeds, but look at herbicides that don't stick around as long. Look for half-lives that are less than 30 days because those are some cover crops that are very susceptible to injury.
Okay, next question is, have you had any experience with oats for interseeding in corn?
I have. So we did interseed oats. Interseeding at knee-high corn or V5, we didn't have any success. The first year it germinated, the second year it germinated, came out of the ground about an inch, and then it died because of the shade canopy. We've seen phenomenal success with oats when we overseed oats at 50% dry down. So about 10 days before silage harvest, or that 50% dry down for corn grain where the plant is dry up to the ear, oats has done really well. We've seen quite a bit of biomass accumulation in that system.
Next question is, I want to interseed cover crops but am concerned about weed management. What cover crops would you recommend and how would you control the weeds?
Another great interseeding question. So to control the weeds, I look at using a program that's going to work with your most troublesome weed species. If you have waterhemp, go after the waterhemp. Giant ragweed, go after the giant ragweed. And then start to look at your cover crop species. Our data indicates that red clover and Indian ryegrass are going to be the two cover crop species to interseed. And then now you've got to narrow down a herbicide that's going to work with those two cover crops. Make sure that you're weed free at the time that you interseed. That's going to be critical.
Okay, next question is, what seeding rate would you suggest for winter rye when planting for weed control?
I would go at least 120 pounds. 40 to 60 pounds is our typical baseline recommendation for soil health building. The more seed that we can have out there, the more biomass you're going to have. You have to have a plan to manage that biomass in the spring. You have to be able to plant into that. In our trials with Colby's work, we didn't have any problem planting in 60 pounds of winter rye with a 1984 white planter that wasn't set up for planting green or anything. No special modifications or anything. The more residue, like the photo that I showed later on in the producer planting out in the field, this slide here, that producer set up and optimized his planter to plant into that winter rye. Again, it wasn't a crazy high seeding rate of that rye either, but there was quite a bit of biomass to deal with. So you have to have a plan for that. In organic systems, the recommendation is 3 bushels per acre. So the more seed we can put out there, the longer that weed control is going to be. Research has shown that winter rye in a cropping system and a soybean rotation is going to be as effective at controlling weeds if we have a nice stand of winter rye as adding another herbicide to the toolbox.
All right, last question is, what cropping systems do cover crops work well for weed control?
The easiest one to start in is whenever we're growing soybeans. Plant a fall seeded cover crop to plant soybeans into. That's going to be the baseline. That's a really nice system to look at. We're looking at a long-term rotation where we're on a livestock producing farm, maybe a silage with 4 years of alfalfa. We can look at maybe an aerial application of rye into that silage corn and then planting alfalfa with maybe some oats, that type of thing, after the oats have winter killed. We can also look at planting winter rye, harvesting that for forage after we've terminated our alfalfa, and then planting corn silage into that residue. And then moving on from there is kind of cover crops 201 and 301, where we start to look at mixes and we start to look at using more diversity in our crop rotations. Soybeans, the easiest way to get started.
All right, in the interest of time, I'd like to wrap up the Q&A. I want to thank you again, Daniel, for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time to share your work.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you, and thanks for everyone who attended. I'm glad that we could share this information.
Okay, at this time, I want to recognize our Premier Egg Retailer members, the Andersons, a Gold member, and Silver members, Gertie Egg, Pandora Grain and Supply, and Nutrient Egg Solutions. Their contributions helped make this webinar possible and help promote the strides that egg retailers are making to reduce nutrient impairments. For more information on membership and all the benefits that come with it, contact our project manager at caitlin@partnershipfarm.org or visit our website and click Become a Member to fill out our online form. I'd like to acknowledge additional funders and collaborators that made this webinar possible, in particular the McKnight Foundation and the Great Lakes Protection Fund. If you are interested in sponsoring future webinars, please contact me at julia@partnershipfarm.org or visit our website. Help us keep these webinars free by making a tax-deductible donation to PARM. By giving just $50 today, you can support this webinar series that provides the egg community with the latest research on nutrient management from experts across the United States, as well as continuing education units to crop advisors. I'd like to thank our recent donors, the University of Toledo Department of Environmental Sciences, Keys Seed Service LLC, and Mark Ruddy. Go to partnershipfarm.org/donate to contribute today. We will also send a donation link in our follow-up email along with the webinar recording and evaluation. As we wrap up, Please remember to look for the follow-up email in a few days with the webinar evaluation and webinar recording. If you submitted your CCA number at registration and are viewing this webinar live or the recording within 2 weeks of the original date, your CEUs will be automatically submitted. Only if you watch the recording more than 2 weeks after the original broadcast date will you need to email julia@partnershipfarm.org your CCA number to ensure your CEUs are submitted. One last reminder to please take our annual survey and our webinar evaluation. The link to the evaluation and survey is provided on this slide, and both will be emailed to all registrants in a few days. This evaluation is a great way to let us know what topics you want to hear about on future webinars. I want to thank you all again for joining us today, and I hope you join us for our next webinar.